Hi everybody, and welcome back to Language and Communication with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. Today's lecture is titled Implicative Relations, or Saying Without Stating and the Rules of Conversation. This is going to be an interesting one. I think it follows very nicely from the use and psychological theory stuff that I discussed last time. But in any case, what we're covering today is Chapter 13 from Lacan's book. In addition to the paper by Grice, Logic and Conversation. So that's what we're covering today, and the objectives for today are to begin by taking a sort of step back and trying to set our course and what we've been learning within this course within a context, and that context is the study of language as a whole. So not just the particular aspects of the philosophy of language that we've been looking at within the analytic tradition, but we're going to kind of look at the three main areas in linguistics. I'll introduce some new terminology throughout this lecture and on the following slide as well. Just know that part of our discussion is going to be geared towards talking about how what we're dealing with now and what we have dealt with in this class, how all of that fits into semantics, syntax, and pragmatics, which are the three branches of linguistics that I'm going to go over with you. So, we're going to talk about, after this, ways of saying things, ways of saying things without stating meanings. So this is an idea called implicature. This comes from Grice, and we can imply things in conversation by using sentences that don't logically entail what those sentences say. Again, I'll explain what this means, but basically, in a nutshell, this is more of using language wrong, at least in terms of what the sentences we utter mean in like a logical sense. We can still say things, and we can still have people understand us. So we're going to talk about how we convey meaning. We're going to talk about word choice. We're going to talk about some ideas from Strawson and Searle. And then finally, we're going to get on to Grice's Cooperative Principle and his idea of conversational maxims. As we'll see, Grice has this idea that conversation is governed by this cooperative principle, which encapsulates a number of different maxims that we apply. So we'll talk about Grice's cooperative principle and the associative maxims. We'll talk a little bit about relevance theory, which is an alternative to Grice's account of language. Then we'll come back to Grice's cooperative principle for a little bit. And round out the lecture by just kind of not chit-chatting, but, talking about some of the important ideas we find in Grice. And these ideas namely being like conversational implicature, which is a very, that's kind of Grice's claim to fame. And even though some of the nuts and bolts of how this might work, in terms of, say, how does this work in the mind? How does this work in the brain? How is the cooperative principle and how are these associated maxims realized in the brain? We can kind of bracket that stuff. We'll talk a little bit about it, but we'll round it out with a little discussion of implicature and those big Gricean ideas in general. Okay, so let us get started. All right, so I want to turn your attention now to slide number 3, where the three branches of linguistic study are summarized. Now, these are listed in order of, I guess, how fundamental they are in a certain respect. But in any case, the first branch is syntax. Syntax is where we're studying grammar, rules of language formation. Basically, how do we use these signs and symbols that we've got, and how can we legitimately combine them? What are the rules for building, words out of symbols and building sentences out of words, for example? What are the grammatical rules that underwrite all of this? That's the study of syntax. Next, we have the study of semantics, and that's primarily what we've been concerned with here. How do linguistic expressions refer to the world? In other words, how, or hey, maybe linguistic expressions don't refer to the world, right? We've seen this idea before. They may refer to ideas or something. But anyway, semantics is really all about the study of meaning. Where does language get its meaning from? Where do these signs and symbols that we use in language, our words and strings of words, whole sentences, whole paragraphs, where do they get their meaning from? How are they grounded? Does meaning come from linguistic utterances referring to things or attributing properties to things? Is it a matter of how they're used? Do they get meaning by conjuring up certain thoughts and images in the hearer's mind, right? Where does meaning come from? That's what semantics is all about. So I hope you can see how a lot of what we've talked about already fits into this branch of semantics. And the third one is pragmatics. And pragmatics is all about the social nature and function of language and linguistic expressions. How does language work in a real world with real speakers, in a real context, in real time, so on and so forth, right? And how does all of this affect the meaning of language? You may have noticed that this is the start of what we've been getting into recently, pragmatics, especially with use theorists. I see pragmatics as being very heavily influenced by, or not influenced by, but pragmatics is very salient when I read use theorists about language. So, important to mention, all of these overlap in different ways, right? For example, I just mentioned how semantics and pragmatics kind of overlap. How do words get their meaning? Well, it may depend on the context in which they're uttered, in which case there's a significant overlap between semantics and pragmatics. There's overlap between syntax and semantics too. I don't know how familiar any of you are with John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment. I'll try and find a video that explains it to link to you. But this thought experiment is directed at showing you what Searle takes to be a difference between syntax and semantics, even though many early computer scientists and artificial intelligence folks thought that artificial intelligence was just a matter of manipulating symbols in the right way. Again, this is a bit beyond the scope of this course, but Searle's whole point here is that you can have a machine that does fine with the syntax, but doesn't understand anything. So for Searle, syntax is not semantics, right? For other thinkers, syntax and semantics are more related to one another. So that's this overview, right? And we've generally focused on semantics in this course. As I've said, we've had some contact with pragmatics, yes, but now we're really going into pragmatics. So I want you to just be aware of these three branches as we move forward in the course. And if you're thinking about some of the material that we've already learned, or as you continue to think about the material that you have yet to learn, keep these three branches in mind and always ask yourself, where is what we're talking about fitting in here? Is it semantics, pragmatics, syntax, or is there some overlap? It's a good thing to keep in mind when you're studying philosophy of language. All right. So, before I go on, I want to talk a little bit about speech acts. So let's do that now. All right, so before we get too deep into the material today, I want to talk about speech acts and I want to talk about implying versus entailing. This will be important when we get further into the material. Now, utterances and speech acts. This is slides, these are slides 4 and 5 that I'm working from now, if you're following along. So a lot of utterances, things that we say, whole sentences and so forth, like, I promise to do X or I apologize for doing Y, are performative and should be categorized as what Austin calls speech acts. So if there's this performative aspect to language, that's different, Austin is saying, than something that's like just declarative, right? So if I say it's raining today, that's different from saying I promise, because I promise is performative. So for that reason, it's a speech act. Now, I am kind of oversimplifying things here, right? Austin himself concluded that a lot of utterances actually have a bit of declarative, a bit of a declarative aspect and a bit of a performative aspect, right? But in any case, he thinks that speech acts form the bedrock of communication. And I'm going to read you a quote which I believe is from Austin, but I will read it to you here to try and clarify what Austin is saying. Quote, I cannot slow the expansion of the universe or convince you of the truth of a claim by saying that I am doing so. However, these two cases differ in that the latter, but not the former, is a characteristic aim of a speech act. Okay. So, one characteristic aim of assertion is the production of a belief in an addressee, whereas there is no speech act one of whose characteristics aims is the slowing of the universe's expansion. A type of speech act can have a characteristic aim without each speech act of that type being issued with that aim. Speakers sometimes make assertions without aiming to produce belief in anyone, even themselves. Instead, the view that a speech act type has a characteristic aim is akin to the view that a biological trait has a function. The characteristic role of wings is to aid flight, even though some flightless creatures are winged. Okay, right? Just to read that first line from that quote again. I cannot slow the expansion of the universe or convince you of the truth of a claim by saying that I am doing so. But these two cases differ in that the latter, so convincing you of a claim, is a characteristic aim of a speech act. So speech acts are performative in this kind of way, right? We're trying to, it's a bit like use theories where we're trying to get something to happen with our speech act, and that something is the right kind of mental state, if I'm understanding this correctly. Now, utterances, when they have propositional content, we could categorize those as locutionary. If we're saying that, that's locutionary. But utterances as speech acts may have illocutionary and or perlocutionary force. So, the characteristics in the quote, here it is actually. Yeah, that long quote I just read was from Austin, 1962, page 101. So these characteristic claims in this quote, these characteristic aims of speech acts, are called perlocution. So a perlocutionary force concerns effects on the hearer, convincing them of something or eliciting a certain belief in them, right? So I could persuade you to shut the door, or I could urge you to shut the door. If I'm urging you to shut the door, this is actually illocution, which concerns my intentions as a speaker. But it would be perlocutionary if I tried to convince you to shut the door by giving you reasons, perhaps. So, yeah, I guess a good way to nail down the difference between illocutionary speech acts and perlocutionary speech acts has to do with, whether the focus is on the speaker's intentions or on the effects on the hearer. Illocutionary acts concern the speaker's intention. So I am urging you to shut that door or we'll both become cold. Perlocutionary, on the other hand, involves effects. Like I need to convince you, perhaps you should shut that door because somebody could just come in your house and steal all of your moderately priced musical equipment or something. All right, so now let's talk about the difference between implying and entailing. Now, if a sentence necessarily follows from another sentence, that means that the sentence that follows is entailed by the previous sentence. Say if I was spelling out, like something like a deductive syllogism, but not giving it in like, premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, but just writing it in sentence form in ordinary language, and my final sentence is followed from the first two, right? Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. That last sentence is entailed by the previous sentences, logically, because it follows from those sentences, okay? But if a sentence expresses more than or something different from what it literally expresses, then we say the extra expression is implied by the sentence. So implying or implicating, to use the strict philosophical terminology, is a way of indirectly communicating, where you're not communicating something that follows from the previous thing you've said, that follows from the previous thing you said, and so on and so forth. What you're doing is implying something that's not contained or literally expressed in what you've actually uttered. And this is a really important function. It's really cool that words can do this. And if you think about it, almost all linguistic expressions are not literal. And we're going to get into this more when we talk about metaphor, but a good deal of the English language is what we call dead metaphor. Metaphors which are no longer metaphors, but words in their own right, or phrases in their own right. Just think of the words understanding, right? If I asked you, do you understand the philosophy of language? You don't literally stand under the philosophy of language, right? So this is that kind of thing here that we're getting into. So yes, almost all linguistic expressions are not actually literal. And most competent language users need this understanding of and competence in implication, or implicature, to use the philosophical term. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Let's say there's a scenario where you're asking me where Buddy is, okay? So, you know, where's Buddy? Oh, this is a very Canadian example. You ask where Buddy is. I say, I saw Buddy's car parked in front of Seymour's place. Well, you asked me where Buddy is. But I just told you that I saw his car parked in front of Seymour's place. Now, I've literally said that Buddy's car is parked in front of Seymour's place, but I've implied that Buddy is at Seymour's place. So basically, implying or implicature is a way of indirectly communicating. This is according to Grice, who's, remember, conversational implicature is kind of his thing. So this is important, right? Implication is really interesting, and it's any competent language user requires understanding of implication or implicature. It's kind of you know, when you see this is kind of a source of a lot of comedy, comedic moments, or wacky hijinks, as Dr. Wayne has put in her slides, in films and TV shows. And I'll quote directly from her notes: "The person who doesn't understand the language for whatever reason takes everything literally, and hilarity ensues." Right? I can't come up with a good example. The best example I can come up with is Will's example of the Abbott and Costello skit, Who's on First? It's just worth pointing out, following from that last, example, that other than exceptional cases like, people who don't understand implicature or sarcasm or those kinds of things, for most of us, this comes fairly easy, grasping conveyed meaning. We can go through some examples here. We'll go through a few on the next slide, but we'll go through some, just a quick one here to illustrate the idea that, obviously in a lot of cases of implicature, or when we're kind of conveying a hidden meaning or just implying something, there's a disparity between what we say and what we mean, right? But in spite of this disparity, which sometimes can be quite strong, we almost always grasp the meaning that is implied. So this is to say that we convey meaning that isn't contained in our expressions. And we do this for a variety of reasons, maybe politeness, expediency, or for aesthetics. So for example, you might have gone and seen a movie. You probably didn't see the movie at the theater because of COVID-19 or something, but maybe you watched a movie on Netflix or something, right? And I asked you, how was the movie? You might say something like, oh, well, the special effects were decent and it wasn't that long. That might be a kind of veiled way of you saying, like, it wasn't that great of a movie. Special effects were good, but the plot might not have been great. That's suggested to me by the fact that you said it wasn't too long. More overtly, you might say, when I ask how the movie was, you might say, the popcorn was excellent, or that you caught up on your sleep, implying that the movie was bad, even though you haven't said anything about the movie. in your sentence, right? So here, maybe you're saying it this way because you're trying to be polite. Maybe I really liked the movie. Like, let's make up a movie. Hey, have you seen Transformers 10 yet? And then you might say something like, yeah, I saw it, and I asked you how it was. And you said, well, the special effects were pretty good and it wasn't too long, so yeah, it was all right. Probably means you didn't enjoy Transformers 10 very much. So maybe you're just trying to be polite, but again, maybe you're trying to be expedient. Maybe you don't have time to describe the meal you've just finished because you've got to run and you've just finished lunch. And it was a really good lunch, but you can't really convey to the cook just how good it was with the time you have. So you just say, it was yummy, instead of saying, I really enjoyed how those flavors mingled together as I savored the flavors of the dish or something, right? Something that's a bit more cumbersome to get out. So we grasp these meanings very easily, I guess, when we imply things. Even when there's a disparity between literal meaning, the literal meaning of our expression and what we're trying to actually communicate, we often pick up on this very easily. Sometimes there's quite a lot that's not said that we're invited to infer from what is said. For example, on slide 8, we could, or we do rather, turn conditionals into biconditionals all the time. So example, if you say, if you lend me your class notes, I'll buy you a coffee. That's just a conditional statement. If you do this, then I'll buy this. But we often understand it as a logical biconditional statement, like, if you lend me your notes, and only if you lend me your notes, I'll buy you a coffee. That's not what that sentence in ordinary language says, but that's how we treat it. We're sometimes invited to infer causation, even though causation is not expressed literally in a sentence. For example, Sally watched the chaos grow and smiled to herself. Or perhaps Martha watched the education school burning and smiled with pleasure. Was the pleasure caused by watching the school burn down? Was Sally smiling because she was watching the chaos grow? We're invited to infer this, but it is not explicitly stated in the sentence. And what about this example, where we're invited to make a kind of temporal inference? She took her exams, and then she hit the bar. We're invited to infer that this is the events in which this order happened, even though that's not really explicitly said in this sentence. It's not said, she first took her last exam, and then afterward she hit the bar. All it says is she took her last exam and hit the bar. For all I know, if I was just reading this without inferring this temporal order, for all I know, she could have hit the bar before writing her exam. So, we're invited to make inferences all the time. So, that covers a lot of the background stuff about, what sentences express and what they mean. And this difference between what they literally express and what they actually mean is not new. We've encountered this before, sentence meaning, speaker meaning, that kind of thing, right? So we've covered a lot of the background that we need to cover, and now we're going to dive into conversational implicature. Let's check it out. All right, so conversational implicature. You'll want to recall for this discussion a bit about Grice's psychological account of linguistic meaning, where communication is a matter of, influencing the mental states or the content of other people's mental states, right? It's all a matter of the speaker's intentions, and the listener recognizes those intentions, and so on and so forth. So, for Grice, speaker meaning as communication is communication of the speaker's mental states, right? And from here, Grice started thinking about how communication in all different kinds of conversations is governed and regulated. And he distills these into, a number of norms. He calls them maxims, but they're really norms, which are like guidelines or rules that guideline the conversation. And this is his whole theory of conversational implicature, is his cooperative principle and the maxims that underlie the cooperative principle. So these norms, according to Grice, explain how and why we implicate, why we use conversational implicature. So all of this is Grice developing an account of social norms that govern cooperative conversation. And all of this together is his theory of conversational implicature, right? So the chief norm in this theory of conversational implicature is called the Cooperative Principle, which states, quote, "Make your conversational contribution such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purposes or direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged." You can find this on page 158 of the textbook as well. What does this mean? Well, this is like the main norm that's supposed to capture and tie together all of the conversational maxims that Grice thinks we follow when we're talking with one another, when we have a talk exchange, as Grice calls it. So this theory for Grice explains how speakers can be interpreted correctly as saying something other than what they appear to be saying. So in other words, how speakers can be interpreted to mean something other than what their sentence literally says. So when a speaker does this, the speaker is implicating something, right? Thus, conversational implicature. So to go back to our previous example, if you ask me, "Where's Buddy?" and I say, "I saw Buddy's car parked outside Seymour's," I haven't said literally in my sentence that Buddy is at Seymour's, but I have implied it. So that's conversational implicature. Now, this may seem like a very broad sweeping kind of thing. It might be a little too vague to work. Well, no, it's really pretty airtight, because this norm, again, is underwritten by all these other conversational maxims. We'll get to those in a second. But this principle and the rest of those norms, their whole idea, their whole purpose is to facilitate efficient information exchange in our talk exchanges, right? So, again, all of this is just to help explain how we can be correctly interpreted. You know, if I'm using words in a way other than what they're intended to be used, or other than what, you know, if I'm using words in a way, a sentence in a way that deviates from its sentence meaning, and I'm using my speaker meaning and I'm implying something, I can't just imply whatever I want willy-nilly, right? I can't just use words arbitrarily. I have to do it a certain way, and yet we seem to do this with such fluency, and we seem to pick up on other people's what they're implying and what we're invited to imply by their speech acts. We latch onto it and we figure it out so easily. So there must be some rules that we're following that explains this and how we can use language this way and have it reliably and correctly interpreted by speakers. So that's the idea behind all of this. So the 7 conversational maxims that accompany the cooperative principle are the maxim of strength. So make your contribution as informative as required. There's the maxim of restraint. Don't make it more informative than required. There's the maxim of truthfulness, which says, do not say what you believe to be false. There's the maxim of evidence, which states, do not say that for which you lack evidence. Pretty straightforward. There's the maxim of relevance, which is to be relevant. The maxim of clarity, which says that we ought to avoid ambiguity in uttering our linguistic expressions. And there's the maxim of brevity, which is to be brief, right? Avoid unnecessary prolixity. Don't be tedious or pedantic. Get to the point, right? Now, an important thing to note here for Grice is that we can generate an implicature not only by adhering to these maxims, but also by flouting them, that is, purposely violating them in specific ways, right? So for example, if you ask, how was open mic night? And I say, some people played some notes and said words into a microphone in an angsty fashion. I seem to be violating some of these maxims. I seem to be violating the maxim of clarity, the maxim of relevance. Perhaps you can pick out a couple of other maxims that I'm violating there. But what I'm implying is that open mic probably wasn't that good. The performances were not great. So try and come up with some of your own examples of implying something by following these maxims or by violating these maxims. There's also another little exercise you can do here. You can watch a clip from the movie Moon. Now, there are some spoilers in this clip. Mind you, I haven't seen this movie. This is an example that Dr. Wayne found, but it's a good example where our character who lives on the moon is conversing with his robot, and as you're watching this, just see how these maxims are adhered to or not adhered to. Does the robot imply anything about our lunar character's true nature? Watch the clip. Even if you haven't seen the movie, you can kind of work out what's going on here, and there's a little bit of interesting implicature happening, and it's fun to kind of try and pick out what maxims are being violated and what maxims are not, and what maxims are being flouted and which ones are being adhered to, I should say. So go through that as a fun little exercise, and if you like, let me know if you've identified a maxim that is adhered to or flouted in the comment section. I'll place a link to this video clip in the video description too. There's also a link in the slides that you can follow as well. Conversational implicature has two basic features, and they're both really interesting. Their features are that implicature can be worked out or it could be canceled. So for example, let's say in response to a question about someone's programming skills, I could imply that he is poor and someone has to work it out. So let's say somebody contacts me for a reference for, I don't know, Johnny Computer. Johnny Computer has applied for a job, and the hiring managers contacted me, his old computer programming teacher, for a reference. Now, I could imply that he is poor by writing a reference like, Johnny's handwriting is very good, his attendance was regular, and he has a lovely singing voice, right? Saying nothing good or bad about his programming skills, thereby implying his poor programming skills are poor. And I just kind of, if I let that hang there in that letter, you work it out, right? You work out the inference that I've invited you to make. But I can also cancel it. Let's say it's not a letter, but you're asking me, how's Johnny Computer's programming skills? I could imply that he's poor, but cancel it. I could say, oh, well, he attends lectures regularly and has nice handwriting, lovely singing voice too. Oh, I'm just saying that because I'm in the same barbershop quartet as Johnny Computer. We're always at rehearsal together, and he really does have a lovely singing voice. Good at computer programming too. You should hire him, right? So I can cancel it, or I can let it be worked out by the recipient, by the listener or the hearer. Now, both of these features of conversational implicature have actually motivated some objections to Grice's theory. Now, both of these features, that conversational implicature can be worked out or that it can be canceled, have motivated objections to Grice's theory, suggesting respectively that on the one hand, we don't or can't figure out what is implied, we just know, or that we can't always cancel an implicature in this way. So it's the first objection is saying, well, we don't work out conversational implicature. If I tell you in a letter that Johnny Computer has great handwriting and perfect attendance, but I say nothing about his computer skills, you're not really working that out. It just kind of occurs to you, oh, Johnny Computer must be terrible at computers. And sometimes we can't always cancel an implicature as well. Things to be aware of in terms of what motivates the criticisms of Grice and some of the alternatives to conversational implicature that we're going to turn to next. All right, so let's quickly go through some alternatives to conversational implicature. One of these is called relevance theory. You can read about this in chapter 13 of your textbook. But basically, this theory states that whenever we use a linguistic expression in communication, we do so in a way that assumes its optimal relevance. So we're basically always on the search for what is relevant. And relevance involves this favorable balance of positive cognitive effects, right? We're pattern-seeking animals, and we need to search for what's relevant to our immediate goals to navigate the world and to problem solve and to do all of this stuff. So positive cognitive effects here would consist in a better understanding of the world. Perhaps you could characterize this in terms of the formation of true beliefs, which are important for reasoning, right? This is almost like an evolutionary psychological explanation. It says, basically in the textbook, it says something to the effect that this search for relevance is a basic feature of cognition, and communication exploits this feature of cognition. So if we go with this theory, when we understand what is being implied through, say, sarcasm or just regular old conversational implicature, we're not thinking through how the speaker of that expression we've just heard has flouted this or that maximum. It just kind of happens. This is probably automatic and unconscious, governed by some kind of automatic cognitive mechanisms that we really don't have time to talk about. This would be for more like a neuroscience of language or a cognitive science of language kind of class. We have another alternative, semantic presupposition. This gets us back to definite descriptions and some of what Strawson had to say about definite descriptions. This will also bring us back to the difference between implicature and entailment. So remember, Strawson says of definite descriptions that presuppositions can remove the truth value of an expression without removing the meaning. So remember, we're talking about statements like the President of Canada is wealthy or the King of France is bald, right? So presuppositions can remove the truth value without removing the meaning. That means that we can still understand these sentences as meaningful, and further, that these sentences are not false, they just don't have any truth value, right? Frege would say they have a sense without a referent. Russell would say the propositions they express, the logical statements that are actually expressed are going to be false. But Strawson says, hang on, they're not false, they're just incomplete. They just don't have a truth value. So where one sentence entails another sentence, so we have sentence A and sentence B. Remember, if a sentence is entailed by another, that means that sentence B follows from sentence A. So if sentence A entails sentence B, that's because logically B follows from A. Therefore, B's falsity entails A's falsity. But where one sentence simply presupposes another sentence rather than entails another sentence, then Y's falsity, so we have X and Y instead of A and B. So when one sentence X presupposes rather than entails another sentence Y, then Y's falsity entails a lack of truth value for X, but not X's falsity, right? So when we're dealing with sentences that entail, these would be sentences that we see in formal languages, like the predicate calculus. Then B's falsity entails A's falsity. But when we're talking about presupposition, which is the kind of thing that happens in linguistic expression, when we express sentences like the King of France is bald, well then Y's falsity does not entail that X is false. It only entails that X has no truth value. It has a truth value of zip, nothing, nada. I believe zip is the term used by Lycon in the textbook. And if we move on to slide 15, we can see another bit of a reply to some of these ideas. This slide is entitled Pragmatic Presupposition, Conventional Implicature. So we're talking about conventional implicature, not conversational implicature. What is conventional implicature? Well, unlike conversational implicature, it is immediate and it is non-cancelable, right? So remember, Grice says that conversational implicature has these two features where it can be worked out, it can be left to be worked out, or it can be canceled. That's conversational implicature. Conventional implicature doesn't work like that. It is immediate and it is non-cancelable. So this might apply to sentences that appeal to common stereotypes, like Lenny is talented, but he is modest. Siri is smart, but she is dull. They are liberals, so they are sensitive. These are all presuppositions that we're getting in these sentences, right? An important thing I should mention here is that conventional implicatures are not worked out. They are more automatic. So Grice thinks that we work out conversational implicature. This doesn't seem to happen with conventional implicatures. It's kind of automatic that we understand them. You know, Lenny is talented, but he is modest. There's nothing for me to complete or put together there, and there's no way to cancel that. And even if what's presupposed is false, that doesn't make the rest of the sentence false as well. So Lenny is talented, but he is modest. Oh, but he's modest doesn't mean he isn't talented. Or even if he isn't modest, does not mean that he's not talented. In any case, I think I'm going to move on from this now to indirect force, which is on slide 16. The idea of indirect force is that there are these grammatical moods, three of these grammatical moods that are supposed to correspond to three categories of speech acts: declarative speech acts, interrogative speech acts, and imperative speech acts. So what are these? Well, a declarative speech act is, like making an assertion, making a statement of fact. You know, like the earth is a sphere, is a declarative speech act. An interrogative speech act is all about seeking information, right? What shape is the earth, right? That linguistic expression is an interrogative speech act. If I ask, a geologist or somebody that question. And an imperative speech act is like issuing a directive or a command. So if I say, hey, Mr. Scientist, go and calculate the circumference of the Earth right now, that would be an imperative speech act. So these are all different kinds of moods. But here's the problem. Grammatical mood doesn't have to match the speech act type, and indeed often doesn't in cases of implying. At least if we're thinking about what tends to happen in normal conversation. Like if I said something like, I want you to go to the broccoli festival with me. Well, what kind of speech act is that? It sounds declarative, but what I really want is to invite you to the broccoli festival, perhaps. So perhaps this is really interrogative, or perhaps it's imperative, like a request. I really want you to come with me to the broccoli festival, right? Or what about, can you pass the salt? That seems interrogative, yet I'm not really interested in whether you can pass the salt. I'm asking you to pass the salt. I'm doing something that seems to be more imperative. I'm not really interested in whether you can extend your arm and grab the salt, and whether you can hang on to it as you pass it to me, or whether it will go flying out of your hands and hit somebody in the face. So indirect force, I'm not sure if that can explain how implicature works either. Furthermore, there are non-literal uses of linguistic expressions that serve as the, quote-unquote normal use of of doing this kind of thing. You know, the salt example is a great example of this. If I ask, can you pass the salt? The non-literal understanding, or, you know, if I say, can you pass me the salt? What I really should say is, may you pass me the salt, or would you kindly pass me the salt? But by saying, can you pass me the salt? I'm using it non-literally, and that's the way we tend to use it most often. We say, can you pass me this or that, rather than, would you please pass me this or that? So Searle, remember, this indirect force idea is an extension of Grice's idea that was undertaken by John Searle, and he thinks that we can explain indirect force with Grice's theory of speaker meaning and conversational implicature, and he thinks that we infer that the speaker intends to convey something other than literal meaning, right? So the same problems that we got concerning conversational implicature can apply here too. But I don't want to get hung up on too many of these alternatives and criticisms. As it says in the textbook in chapter 13, Grice's basic idea behind conversational implicature is widely accepted. It's just that some of the finer details are not 100% worked out yet. But most people do accept some version of what Grice is saying with conversational implicature. Anyway, getting back to some more of these maxims, right? We've talked about the conversational principle and the 7 norms that are associated with the conversational principle. There's also some other maxims that kind of help us to categorize our 7 maxims that we talked about earlier. Grice is kind of following in Kant's footsteps by doing this. I might talk a little bit about that in what follows, but maybe not too much, because I don't know if the communication and linguistics students are very familiar with Kant, but I'll just say a little bit about it. But let's turn back to this list of maxims and see if we can categorize them now. So if you're familiar with Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason, you'll know about Kant's categories of understanding. These are kind of like ways in which the mind structures the world for us, according to Kant. And Grice is doing something here with categories of, I guess, linguistic or conversational understanding. And he has 4 of them: quantity, quality, relation, and manner. The 7 maxims that we talked about earlier fit into each of these 4 categories, and each category has a super maxim associated with it. So on top of our hierarchy of ideas here, we have our cooperative principle, and it's underwritten by these 4 kind of categories which have super maxims and then particular maxims underneath, which are the 7 ones we went through earlier. So the category of quantity has the super maxim, try to make your contribution one that is true. And under this category, we have the maxim of strength and the maxim of relevance, which we talked about earlier. Similarly, under the category of quality, which has the super maxim, be perspicuous, we have the maxim of truthfulness and the maxim of evidence. So don't say things you know to be false, don't say things you don't have evidence for. Under the super category of relation, we have the maxim of relevance, and under the category of manner, we have the maxims of clarity, which is to avoid obscurity and ambiguity and be orderly, and the maxim of brevity, which is to avoid prolixity. So this is like the hierarchy of all the maxims that underwrite the cooperative principle. Now, there might be other maxims that guide our talk exchanges. Grice concedes this. Perhaps articulacy or politeness or things like this. Maxims to do with being polite might guide conversation, or with being articulate would guide conversation. But these maxims, Grice thinks, are connected to particular exchanges and not linguistic communication in general. And the reason is because of course, the maxims that Grice is interested in here are particularly concerned with maximally efficient exchange of information, which is what communication is all about for Grice. So moving on from slide 18 to slide 19, we'll try to connect the cooperative principle and all of its associated maxims with conversational implicature. So you can find in Logic and Conversation on page 48 and 49, Grice talking about how the conversational principle dictates what you can do in a talk exchange, right? According to the conversational principle, in any talk exchange, one may adhere to a conversational maxim. One could surreptitiously violate the maxim, opt out from the maxim, face a clash of maxims, or flout or exploit the maxim. And these are all different ways in which we can engage in communication. All ways we can imply things by violating or adhering to the maxims of the cooperative principle in highly specific ways. So in a lot of ways, Grice points out in this paper that the conversational principle, the cooperative principle, resembles a kind of social contract, right? So if you're familiar with Rawls, for example, those philosophy students who know about social contract theory in ethics, conversational implicature and the cooperative principle especially is like a social contract in terms of how it facilitates cooperative transactions. You know, there are rules that we've all got to agree to play by. It's not like your usual social contract in that we specifically endorse these rules, or that we grow up in a society where these are the rules and you learn them and you learn to behave according to the rules. These are linguistic rules, not societal rules. But nonetheless, I do see the parallels between what Grice is saying here with the maxims that underwrite the cooperative principle and something like a social contract. But if that's not clear to you, let me know. You know, leave me a question in the comments section. Hit me up on Discord, email, question and answer forum on See You Learn. You know, lots of different ways to ask me questions about this. On slide 20, we get back to conversational versus conventional implicature again. So remember, conversational implicature may not be or is not typically grasped automatically, according to Grice, but is instead worked out by the interpreter. Conventional implicature isn't like that, right? So, for example of conversational implicature, consider a scenario where maybe one of your friends invites you to a party. Your reply to your friend is no thanks, another round of small talk is bound to finish me. What have you communicated there? It's not immediately clear, right? But if you think about it, if you let it stew for a second, you can work out that your friend rather would work out that you've probably said that you can't stand small talk, you're too tired, perhaps all the small talk at the party would just finish you completely, put you to sleep, right? So you're communicating effectively that you don't want to go to the party. But according to Grice, you have to work that out. It's not automatic, right? Because remember, conversational implicatures can either be left there to be, you know, kind of picked up on by the other party, or they can be canceled. So that's conversational implicature. I don't know. I have to say that as a cognitive scientist, this strikes me as a strange idea. The reason has to do with the fact that when I lecture in my cognitive science classes, and I want to give you an idea of what I mean by a cognitive process that is unconscious and automatic, I often use speaking and understanding a natural language. The example I usually use is this. If you are a native speaker of English, that means if your first language was English, that's what your parents spoke and that's what you grew up speaking, then try this exercise. Try not understanding what I am saying to you right now. Can you do it? Probably not. Why? Because whatever mental machinery is underwriting this process, it is unconscious and automatic. You don't need to make an effort to understand a linguistic utterance. I think this is probably true for a lot of non-literal implicative kinds of speech expressions as well. So I don't know. I'm just saying that to me, I'm not sure if I follow Grice here, but I'm not going to go out on a limb and say he's wrong. I want you to understand that Grice says that conversational implicature is something that has to be worked out by the interpreter. I'm hesitant to say I agree with that. I think it's maybe a little bit more automatic than Grice does, but nonetheless, this is Grice's position. Now let's get back to the example. You've declined to go to the party because of this small talk. Your friend will probably immediately grasp that you're unlikely to go right away. But the friend may still need to figure out, based on considerations like contextual cues and knowledge about you, what else you're saying through the implication. You might be saying, for example, that you find the people who will be there superficial and dull, or that you feel socially incompetent, or that you're going through a bit of a hermit phase, right? So if and when the implied meaning here is immediately intuitively grasped, Grice thinks it actually won't count as conversational implicature unless the intuition is replaceable by an argument. So Grice is saying that even if I do intuitively come to understand that you don't want to go to the party because you're in a hermit phase, even though you haven't said that, if I can replace my intuitive leap there with like an argument, like a formal, systematic premise, conclusion type of thing, something that's propositional, then it doesn't count as conversational implicature. Again, I find this weird because it's possible that our brains are doing this kind of thing automatically. And even if you don't instantly grasp what your friend means beyond that he doesn't want to go to the party, you still very quickly work out from the context, at least sometimes. I don't know. I will admit something to you all. I am very bad at understanding sarcasm and subtext and all of that stuff. And there have been times, I kid you not, when it's several days after someone has said something to me, and I'm thinking about it again, I'm thinking about the conversation, where I will finally get the subtext several days later, or finally get that it was sarcastic several days later. Not all the time, but sometimes this does happen. So I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe Grice is right. But in any case, this is what he says to distinguish conversational implicature from conventional implicature. Conversational implicature is not immediate, it's not automatic, it requires an interpreter, and even if it is immediately or intuitively grasped, if you can replace it with an argument, it does not count as conversational. It would count as conventional, as would, a number of other things that aren't speech acts, the kinds of things you might read in a paper by Bertrand Russell, for example. There'd probably be a lot of conventional implicature there. So, now what about conventional implicature? Well, as you probably have guessed, Grice is going to say that it is processed automatically. The implied meaning in conventional implicature is a result of pre-established conventional semantics and syntax. So, for example, consider a scenario where you're describing a classmate, to your roommate. You state that, quote, Blaze always has the best answers. He must therefore be a very clever guy. Now, your roommate doesn't have to do any extra thinking here to grasp what you have implied, but not directly stated. That Blaze must be clever because he always has the best answers, because we already associate the idea of somebody always having the right answer as being a clever person. It's a salient property of clever people in many people's minds. So here there's a pre-established conventional kind of semantics and syntax happening, and that's why you immediately and automatically pick up on what you state when you describe your classmate Blaze to your roommate. Your roommate understands right away because your utterance and its meaning, or what you're implying, is kind of resting upon this pre-established or conventional semantics and syntax. Okay? So before I wrap up today, I just want to draw your attention to something on slide 23, and that is the variance in application on all of these different maxims that Grice is talking about that underwrite the cooperative principle. These maxims can come into conflict with one another. Communicators can violate a maxim for the sake of preserving another maxim, or they might deliberately flout a maxim for some effect. And I want to go over some examples of these things before wrapping it up. So if we flout, something to do with the maxim of quantity, or the category of quantity, one of the associated maxims there, that might be something like writing, tenuously related things in a recommendation letter, right? Johnny Computer's recommendation letter. If I write that his penmanship is wonderful and his attendance is spectacular, right? I'm flouting the maxim of quantity. I can flout quality by using irony or metaphor, right? I can violate relation by responding with a non sequitur to indicate that I disapprove of something that you've just said. Say somebody says something incredibly rude and I just don't want to respond. I might respond with a non sequitur like, boy, the sky sure is blue today. You can find a list that explains some of these features of conversational implicature on page 57, I believe, of our readings. In any case, just be aware. And if you want, on the final slide, there was a group exercise that was to be given, were the class to take place in a live lecture. Obviously, we're not doing that. But if you really want to challenge yourself, you can work on this on your own. You can try and compose a short talk exchange that illustrates the connections between the cooperative principle, say 2 or 3 of its maxims, and conversational implicature. Right? You don't have to do any of the other stuff like pretending to talk it out to the class. Obviously, that won't work. But if you can work this out for yourself, you can kind of clarify how the maxims that underwrite the cooperative principle connect to conversational implicature, and further how conversational implicature differs from conventional implicature. But that is all I have for this lecture for today. I know this has been a dense one, and I have another one that I have yet to record today because I'm really trying to get caught up. So this has been a very dense one, but as you know, there are myriad ways to get in touch with me. Discord, email, YouTube comments, See You Learn discussion forums. If any of you have any questions about this material, do let me know. I know you're all probably very busy writing your essays right now, but when you're done your essay and you watch this lecture, and if you come up with a question because something I've said is not clear, let me know. I will do my best to explain it to you as best as I can. However, that is all for this lecture. The next lecture, which I'm going to start recording shortly, will be all about metaphor. So I will see you guys then. Take care.